She believes in community and empowering young people to advocate for their future. Without Julia, I wouldn't have this platform to speak with you today. Thank you for being here and helping me to continue my work towards climate justice. Now I'll hand it off to Julia Olson, Executive Director and Chief Legal Counsel of Our Children's Trust, an organization she founded to advocate for the legal rights to a healthy atmosphere and stable climate for all. Thank you.
Hi everyone, good evening. Thanks for being here. And Hazel, thank you so much for that really sweet introduction. It's an honor to be your mentor and your attorney. I also want to give a special thanks to Shane Davis and all of the conference co-directors for the invitation to speak tonight, but also for all the hard work that they put into making this conference possible and the decades of students that have done so year after year. It's a particular honor to be keynoting here tonight 20 years after I came to my first PIELC as a brand new lawyer. And I'm going to share a little bit about my journey tonight, because my journey into the law has been one of trauma, adventure, successes, losses, transformation, and ultimately deep hope. PIELC and the law school here at the University of Oregon have been a transformative part of that experience and really important on this journey. So a thank you to everyone who's been involved in the conference and the University of Oregon for carrying forth this tradition and the inspiration that the conference brings to better all of the work that we do together to protect the planet and people. So I want to share a brief look back at my personal history, and then a piece of our history as a nation, and weave together some of the shared stories that we have that have taken us to this precipice where we're at today, and a precipice that we will step over in a flash of time. One journey off the precipice would be the result of passive acceptance of our current situation, a resignation of sort that lacks creativity and ingenuity, that leads humanity and the planet to dangers and conditions that are hard to fathom. The other journey off the precipice will lead us to a great transformation in the way we use energy and make energy, and the way we create and form community and engage in democracy. And most importantly, in the way we truly demonstrate our love for and the value of children and the generations that will come after us. So my journey into law began when I was 17 years old, and it's a journey not unfamiliar to many children today. When I was 17, I was in my safe neighborhood in Colorado in a car when I was shot in the chest with multiple rounds by a man who had a large gun collection, mental illness, and an AR-15 at the ready. I am fortunate to be a survivor of an assault weapon today, and hear the irony in those words. But earlier this week, I spoke to a mother and a lawyer from Parkland, Florida, who waited an agonizing 12 minutes to hear whether her son was still alive, and to find out that his best friend was not. And that was after the mass shooting, of course, at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. So in honor of those children and the teachers who lost their lives, and in solidarity with the youth who are rising up in the face of that violence, I want to take a moment just to recognize them. So my entree into law was in the criminal justice system as a victim, and it led me to deeply question what justice means to me. I became passionate about gun control, the criminal justice system's focus on incarceration, the death penalty, punishment, and I really believed in the deeper pathways to reform and healing, creating healthy communities, and restorative justice. And as well, I grew up in these beautiful mountains in Colorado. And I had an ingrained passion for nature and addressing the global ecological crises that I learned about when I went to college. And so for me, the answers to the questions about redressing the exploitive misuse of both fossil fuels and guns really requires us to confront as a nation what we want for our youth. Do we want a nation ravaged by violence and fear from climate disruption and mass shootings, or one where our governments act to safeguard young people? Both require of us full democratic engagement with every branch of government. And that leads me to my journey to our Children's Trust. So during my early career as a public interest environmental attorney, I played this game of whack-a-mole. And I did a lot of the traditional defensive environmental statutory work that many of us who come to this conference do, and that is still very critical. I don't want to say that it's not. But what I began to learn is that it wasn't going to be the whole solution to the climate crisis. So one of my first climate change cases was in the early 2000s, when a subsidiary of San Diego Gas and Electric decided to build 2 power plants south of the border in Mexicali. The Department of Energy and other federal agencies were permitting pipelines that were bringing natural gas from the United States into Mexico in order to produce energy there, and then they were permitting the transmission lines that were coming from Mexico back into the United States. And why? To avoid US environmental law and to site polluting power plants in disadvantaged communities of people of color. So on behalf of a border working group that involved Mexican and American citizens, we filed suit, and we initially stopped the project and required these agencies to go and do a full environmental analysis, and for the first time disclose the cumulative impacts of carbon dioxide emissions on climate change, even though those emissions were largely coming from power plants in Mexico. But although we won the first round, the project ultimately went forward, as many of these projects do under our system of environmental statutory law. Around the time I had children, and this is a great photo at Country Fair. You should always paint your pregnant belly like an earth. I was pregnant with my second son, Bay, at the time, and I sat through an inconvenient truth and had immense grief. And I really started thinking, what can we do as an environmental law community to not just play defense, but to go on the offense? And then I met this woman. And if you've had the pleasure of an hour with Mary Wood, you know that her infectious optimism, her fierce determination, and her brilliant legal mind are no match for her ability to persuade you that it's totally possible to bring atmospheric trust litigation in all 50 states and against the federal government and globally within a year's time, all on the same day. And so all we needed was a ragtag band of lawyers, and that's what we did. So a small group of us, we formed our Children's Trust in 2010, and by Mother's Day 2011, we were bringing legal actions in every state around the country and against the federal government, and in a couple of other countries as well, all on behalf of young people. And we were simultaneously marching in the streets with youth who were leading marches around the world. And we were representing many of them. Those are my 2 little ones. So from the beginning, our Children's Trust has had 3 core principles. And it's surprising how hard we have to fight to convince people of the validity of these principles at times. The first is that we advocate and elevate the voice of youth and future generations for climate justice. And we know all of you adults out there, you're important too, but you can vote and you're older and you're not going to live with the consequences of climate change quite as long. And we really believe young people deserve a say in this struggle. We also advocate only for science-based and legally enforceable remedies. So we're not looking at the Paris Agreement and 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius as being acceptable for young people. We're really looking at what scientists say is necessary to protect them, their property, their liberties, their lives. And lastly, we work with fundamental human rights laws and principles, including the public trust doctrine, and I'll talk more about those later. People often ask, why youth? And many people think at times they question whether the young people are really leading or whether we're dragging the youth with us. And I want to emphasize how clear it is that these youth are leading, as they have throughout our history. So there's been a long discrimination in our country of harm to young people because government has had laws and policies that discriminated against youth. Beginning with young people's struggle for justice in the labor movement and getting labor laws passed that protect them. This is Claudette Colvin. In 1955, she was 15 years old, and she was the first young woman to refuse to give up her seat on the bus. After she was arrested and went to jail, she became one of the plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale, the Supreme Court case which legally ended racial segregation on public transportation in the state of Alabama. And then, of course, the Little Rock Nine, who went to school every day under the threat of violence and fear and hate. And young Ruby Bridges in 1960, who became the first African American to integrate an all-white elementary school in New Orleans, Louisiana. She went to school for a whole year by herself, where one teacher taught her. And then in 1963, the thousands of students who marched on Birmingham, in a city that was known to be one of the most racist cities in the South. They were subject to violence, of course, but that movement of young people marching in those streets changed a nation. It turned the public tide in support of the civil rights movement. And then, of course, there are the youth-led dreamers who won protection under DACA, still continue to fight for it today in the face of the Trump administration trying to undo that protection. And the movement for racial justice continues today, and always it is led by youth. And of course, most recently, the young people who are rising up under the banner "Enough is Enough" after the mass shooting in Parkland. Young people have always made these bold and unflinching demands for a world that values their safety, their security, and their equality. And they've often had to fight for it in the courts, including these youth. So these are our 21 plaintiffs in Juliana versus the United States. And they, along with many other youth around the country and around the globe, are all rising up for climate justice, to hold their governments accountable for the dangerous climate conditions that they fostered, and in order to protect their fundamental rights. So why the courts? Well, for decades, governments and world leaders have talked and agreed to hold more meetings and one day commit to binding emission reductions. And believe me, we've been looking at this evidence, and it's amazing, the same sentences over and over and over for decades about what they will one day do. But even if all the governments in the world actually did what they claim they will voluntarily do under the Paris Agreement, the world will be 3 degrees Celsius warmer and we'll lose the ice on the planet. So just for context, when I was born, carbon dioxide concentrations were 326 parts per million. And and they were talking about climate change in 1971, our government. By the time I was in college, we had surpassed the threshold of 350 parts per million. And the governments were developing the world's first climate treaty. And then when we launched this youth-led campaign in 2011, carbon dioxide levels had reached 391. And today we're at 405 and climbing even more quickly than in the past, with record-breaking temperatures that are exceeding climate scientists' expectations. So what we need are binding and enforceable emission reduction targets that are based in science. And so we are turning to the courts around the world. We're supporting youth and attorneys in Uganda, India, Pakistan, who all have active cases. We're also now supporting youth with cases in Sweden, Norway, Colombia. And we're working with youth and attorneys to bring more cases against the governments of Canada and Australia and the European Union countries and Sri Lanka. Youth are literally rising up globally and demanding climate justice in the courts. We're also working in the states at the state level, and I want to highlight 3 of our newer cases. The first is a case that Andrea Rogers just filed against Governor Inslee in the state of Washington. And this lawsuit, it's now our 3rd lawsuit because we will not give up until we obtain justice for these young people. But what this case highlights is the problem of the complacency of sometimes even democratic administrations where governors claim to be climate governors. So the story in Washington is that they have legalized greenhouse gas pollution at a certain level. So they have a statute that says that by 2050, they will reduce greenhouse gases by 50%, okay? So here's one of the allegations in the youth's complaint. Having an emissions level target of 50% by 2050 embedded in law inevitably permits the state and its agencies to violate constitutional rights of children, including the plaintiffs. It is akin to saying in a statute that public education for children can be funded at 50%, or only 50% of public schools need be desegregated to protect the rights of African American children. Absent court intervention, as history has shown, government will do the minimum required of it by the legislature, and young people will suffer. So when our governments make laws that say we only have to do so much, that is all that our government will ever do. And these laws are not good enough anymore. So that constitutional case is going forward. We have a trial date of February 19th, 2019, and we'll keep you posted. Here's some of the amazing plaintiffs in that case, and they include 1/3 of the plaintiffs are members of tribes, including the Quinault tribe, whose sacred lands are being overtaken by the sea and storm surges. The Quinault tribe has developed a $60 million plan to move the entire village of Tohola uphill and out of harm's way. That will mean moving the school, the courthouse, the police station, and the homes of 700 tribal members a safer distance from the encroaching Pacific waters. We also recently filed a case in Alaska. And the Alaska case is similar to the Washington case and other cases that we bring challenging the Alaskan government for its contributions to climate change. So this is Isa, Linnea, Tasha, Cade, Caitlin, Brian, Jode, Margaret, Lexine, Elizabeth, Vanessa, Ananda, Griffin, Cicely, Lila, and Summer. And 5 of these youth are Native Alaskan and also losing their cultural heritage and their sacred lands and homes and their security. These are some of our Florida plaintiffs. The case has not yet been filed, but it will be filed very, very quickly. It's all ready to go. And And this is another amazing group of young people who are literally fighting to save southern Florida and much of coastal Florida so that it can still be on the map. And many of them live in these coastal areas on barrier islands and also in the Keys, and are literally losing their homes and their properties to sea level rise, as well as the threats to groundwater and the health and safety of the Everglades. All right, hopefully this will work. So every constitutional story starts with the plaintiffs. So here are some of our plaintiffs.
My name is Scott. I'm 16 and I've been at the front lines of the struggle for a while now. And it inspires me so much to stand here with these 20 other youth plaintiffs. And every plaintiff has a story. And every plaintiff has a way in which they're going to be impacted by climate change, or already have been impacted by a global problem created by past generations. And this is not easy work. To take time out of our lives to come and do this. Thank you to each and every one of you, to each and every adult who has helped sacrifice to make this happen today. We are making history. And we are standing here today to fight and protect everything that we love. From our land to our waters, to the mountains, to the rivers and forests. To fight for our family, for future generations, for our children, for the planet that we will leave them. We stand here today changing history because this is the moment where we decide what kind of legacy we are going to leave behind to future generations. And we're not heroes, and we're not any different than any other young people on the planet. We have the amazing ability to be able to come together like this. And we're fighting for the futures of every young person in the crowd today, of every young person in the world today. That's what we are standing to protect. Thank you. And this cause, we will not back down. We will not be silenced. We will not allow multi-billion-dollar industries to silence our voices. We will not allow the federal government to silence our voices. We will continue to stand in our courts, in our streets, and on the front lines of fossil fuel infrastructure until every pipeline has been shut down, until we force the federal government to put in place climate recovery plans to ensure a healthy, just, sustainable planet for our generation and those to follow. Thank you.
So this is Jamie. She's Diné Navajo from Arizona. And Jamie's impacts are around drought and heat that is drying all the water from her homelands, her cultural lands that her people are losing. And this issue of drought and heat affects young people everywhere. So Avery, who lives here in Eugene, she talks about the drought conditions in terms of its impact on salmon. And Avery will tell you that she will look into the eye of a salmon and she sees beauty and life and sadness and grief, knowing what's happening to them. And Hazel, too, is impacted in the special areas she likes to visit and the low water levels that we will increasingly see and we're headed for this summer again. Nick lives in Colorado. And Nick is passionate about the forests and loves to go to Rocky Mountain National Park, where pine beetle kill is having catastrophic consequences to the forests. And I want to show you what we're doing in terms of some of the evidence we're developing in the case is using time lapses to show the damage to plaintiffs and the resources they depend upon. So it should play here. So this is one of the exhibits to one of our expert reports. This is in Rocky Mountain National Forest. And what was shocking to me when I first saw some of this time-lapse photography is how quickly the pine beetles, when they infect the trees, how quickly the trees die. So this is in a matter of months that you go from a healthy forest to one that's lost a significant portion of trees and is dying. And it's working with experts and people around the country videographers, photographers to really capture the evidence and document it and get it into court. And that's part of the work that we're doing as we prepare for trial. So that's June to November of 1 year. Shatescott has similar impacts with the loss of forest around his home in Boulder, Colorado, and the fires that they've been experiencing, not uncommon to those of us in Oregon either. This is Alex, who has a farm down near Roseburg, Oregon, and they've been suffering from drought conditions, heat, and fire as well, which constantly are threats to their property and their farm. Same with Jacob, who works daily on his farm down near Roseburg, and last summer was farming with a mask on during dangerous air quality conditions, and as many of you probably remember, temperatures over 100 degrees consistently. But even up in Seattle, Aji was experiencing air quality impacts in an urban area, again from the wildfires. He lost a week of school in Seattle. And so did Isaac in Portland. So these are becoming the norms as our fire season extends by hundreds of days and the conditions for fire intensify. Zealand, who lives here in Eugene, knows about fires and has had to evacuate from trips because of the increased incidence of wildfires. But this last fall, he had a profoundly personal experience in his family where his grandmother lost her home at a trailer park in Santa Rosa during the Santa Rosa fires. And many of his family members were displaced as well during that fire. And a lot of you have probably heard Jaden's story, where she woke up in August of 2016, stepped out of her bed into water in her home. She had storm water and sewage water running through her house due to floods that were called a 1,000-year flood event that are now coming every year or two in her region, even though the government tells her she lives outside the flood zone. And Victoria, who lived through Hurricane Sandy and experienced what it's like, what will come to New York as sea levels continue to rise and storms continue to surge. Sophie, too, in Pennsylvania, has become accustomed to the storms and the extreme events that they're seeing that are totally atypical for her region as well. So we have fires and droughts. We also have storms and sea level rise. And Sahara's family has property on the coast near Yachats. And our sea level rise experts project that her community there and their property will eventually be underwater if trends continue. But already we're seeing the loss of beaches and erosion and impacts to infrastructure all up and down coastal areas across the country. Karen experiences the same types of impacts as well, living in the Northwest. This is Miko, and Miko has a unique story among the plaintiffs because she was born in the Marshall Islands, and her family is in the Marshall Islands, her heart is in the Marshall Islands, and of course, the Marshall Islands are fighting for survival, a way of life, lands, culture, history, a people who may have to totally abandon the homes they once knew. And Levi. Levi lives on a barrier island, and Levi knows and has nightmares about the fact that he too will one day have to abandon his home if things don't very quickly change. And this is an example of another piece of evidence that we'll use sea level rise simulations. This is based on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's projections from about a year ago. So they said this is the amount of sea level rise that we expect to see this century. Our experts say these projections are pretty underestimated, but nonetheless, we're using it as evidence in the case about their own admissions. So this is panning in using Google Maps to see Levi's home and his community. think it's going. Is it stuck? But anyway, it shows a simulation of the seas rising. And eventually the island is gone. And in fact, 30 kilometers into Florida on the eastern seaboard is gone within this century. So this is Journey. And Journey is Yankton Sioux. He's from South Dakota. But he lives in Hawaii, and he's really adopted the cultural, traditional practices of the native Hawaiians. And he also has ocean impacts, sea level rise, as well as impacts to the coral reef in Hawaii. And let's see if this one will work. This is another time-lapse series with the generous contributions of Jeff Orlowski and Chasing Coral. They are allowing us to use some of this evidence of what's happening to coral reefs around the world. So this is a reef on the Great Barrier Reef, but it's very symbolic of what's happening to reefs around the world. And that happens in a matter of months. And this is Nathan. And Nathan lives in Alaska. And glaciers are a really important part of Nathan's life and just the wilderness in Alaska. He's a hunter and a fisher, and you probably all are familiar with this as well. This is more time-lapse footage from James Baylog and Chasing Ice that they too are letting us use for evidentiary purposes in the case. So Mendenhall Glacier in Alaska, and again, this is typical of what's happening, as you know, to glaciers around the world. But really compiling this type of visual evidence is the way we want to communicate part of what this constitutional conversation is about and what it means for young people in their lives and for future generations that may never see a glacier like that. When I talked to James Baylog recently, he told us that they've been shocked at how much more loss there's been even since they made the film Chasing Ice. And they've continued to document the loss through photography. So this goes all the way to 2017, I believe. 2016, sorry about that. And Kelsey Juliana, the case's namesake. This is a picture of Willamette Pass from just a couple weeks ago, which is indicative of the snowpack conditions that we're seeing in Oregon, which is the heart of some of the impacts of the Oregon plaintiffs, like Tia, who grew up in Bend skiing, cross-country skiing, and really engaging in winter and winter activities are the heart of her story and the losses that she's experiencing, which also, again, feeds back into our water supply. So we know that all of those impacts and all of those stories that are true for these plaintiffs, but also true for children around the world, are the result of some very obvious causes. And the common thread is global fossil fuel use and consumption for a century, but really when you can see that it started to ramp up was in the 1950s. And ironically, it was around that time that the understanding about what burning fossil fuels would do to our climate system also started to crystallize. So the burning of coal, oil, and gas has been steeply on the rise, along with deforestation and animal agriculture. As fossil fuel burning increased, so too have the carbon dioxide emissions, which have been tracked first by the calendar curve through the 1950s, and then later by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration from the 1950s onward. This graph is one of my favorites because I think it really reflects one of the most important contributions of science today. And it traces back through historic measurements 400,000 years of the correlation between carbon dioxide levels, the temperature of the Earth, and sea level rise. When carbon dioxide rises, so too does the temperature, and then the seas follow closely behind. What it also frighteningly shows is that for the first time in 400,000 years on this graph, but it actually goes back even farther, humans have caused carbon dioxide levels to rise 125 parts per million above the highest level of the last 400, or and some people say 800,000 years. And you can see that at the far right corner, how we've shot up there. So when, for hundreds of thousands of years, we've fluctuated in these natural points between 180 parts per million and 280 parts per million, we've now shot up to 405. Scientists can't even really reasonably predict how bad that could be, but they've done their best to make projections. But unfortunately, the impacts aren't always linear, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So, well, we're at 1 degree Celsius of heating right now, which is about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit since the Industrial Revolution. And sometimes 1 degree Celsius does not sound like a whole lot. But I had a scientist say to me, imagine living in your body at a baseline temperature of 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit rather than 98.6 and staying there. Minor temperature shifts have profound impacts on living systems. And our government, in admissions we already have in our case, says we are in the danger zone. So I just want that to land a little bit, because when people argue that maybe we could go to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, we're already in the danger zone. And none of us at this conference, or hopefully in our community, should be advocating for any more heating in our system than we already have today. So an important thing to also know is, where's all this extra heat going? Well, most of it's going into the oceans, over 90% in fact, which is why we're seeing so much melting of our ice sheets. And the problem with this is that, as you all might remember from your science classes, water holds heat for a really long time, which is why it poses such a catastrophic threat to the planet from sea level rise. Even when we stop burning the fossil fuels and we stop deforestation and we get on track, we will still have all this excess heat in the system. So the sooner we can turn things around, the better. And just to put that in a little bit of context, under NOAA's modest projections, they say that by mid-century, 2 million American homes could be underwater. And that does not include the number of properties threatened by storm surges, which are many, many millions more. This map shows what the coastline of the United States looked like the last time carbon dioxide levels were over 400 parts per million. And at that time, the seas were 70 feet higher than they are today. 70 feet, once you get all the implications of that level of carbon dioxide. So that's the hard stuff. And I want to get to the hope, because there is hope in this constitutional conversation. I firmly believe that our Constitution was intended as a backstop against injustice and a framework for securing our liberties. So in the Juliana case, we turn to the Fifth Amendment, and we've brought 3 primary claims against the federal defendants for violating their substantive due process rights. In the case, they're challenging the very fossil fuel-powered energy system that the US government has orchestrated for decades and continues to support. And now we're seeing a doubling down on that with the Trump administration. The youth are not challenging a single action, but the whole system of affirmative acts that have led to this problem. And I think by now, none of us should have any pretense that a single administration with its own political agenda, is going to solve this problem in time, absent a constitutional order from the court requiring a remedy that brings our energy system into constitutional compliance. So here are the three substantive due process claims. One is that the government has created a dangerous situation and is infringing on the personal security rights of the youth. The second is that the government, through its affirmative conduct, is infringing on other fundamental rights under the life, liberty, and property rights we have in the Fifth Amendment. And the final argument is that the federal government is infringing on an implied right under our liberties that has now been articulated for the first time as a right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life, and that children as a class are being discriminated against with respect to these rights. We also have argued that the federal public trust doctrine applies and that the government has an obligation as a trustee over our vital natural resources to protect them for all future generations. And those resources that the federal government controls are the sea, the shores of the sea, and of course the air. So after 2 rounds of motion to dismiss briefing and 2 oral arguments, we received an historic order from the U.S. District Court for the District of Oregon. And I'm going to play this video from Judge Ann Aiken's pen to our youth's mouths. Here are her words.
On November 10th of last year, Judge Ann Aiken denied the attempts of the U.S. government and the fossil fuel industry to dismiss our case. We're honored to stand here on these steps and read to you some of our favorite passages from this landmark decision.
This is no ordinary lawsuit.
This lawsuit is not about proving that climate change is happening or that human activity is driving it.
This action is of a different order than the typical environmental case. It alleges the defendant's actions and inactions, whether or not they violate any specific statutory duty, have so profoundly damaged our home planet that they threaten plaintiffs' fundamental constitutional rights to life and liberty.
At its heart, this lawsuit asks this court to determine whether defendants have violated plaintiffs' constitutional rights.
The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution did not create the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The documents are instead vehicles for protecting and promoting those already existing rights.
And the founding fathers were influenced by intergenerational considerations.
They believed the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property were rooted in a philosophy of intergenerational equity.
The genius of the Constitution is that it allows future generations to protect the rights of all persons to enjoy liberty as we learn its meaning.
Plaintiffs do not seek to have this court direct any individual agency to issue or enforce any particular regulation.
Rather, they ask the court to declare the United States' current environmental policy infringes their fundamental rights and direct the agencies to implement an enforceable national plan to stabilize the climate system.
Even when a case implicates hotly contested political issues, the judiciary must not shrink from its role as a co-equal branch of government.
Federal courts retain broad authority to fashion practical remedies when confronted with complex and intractable constitutional violations.
Just as marriage is the foundation of a family, a stable climate system is quite literally the foundation of society, without which there would be neither civilization nor progress.
Exercising my reasoned judgment, I have no doubt that the right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life is fundamental to a free and ordered society.
It's a beautiful opinion. And I'm going to skip a couple of these slides because we lost a little bit of time. But she goes further into talking about this constitutional conversation and the importance, the vital importance of the courts in participating in it as one branch of government. So I want to skip a little bit and talk about this man. So this is the drafter of the Fifth Amendment. And part of what we're doing in the case is we are looking back at our nation's history, and we're weaving together these stories, which is what you do when you're presenting a constitutional case and thinking about one day going up to the Supreme Court and looking at it through their eyes. And James Madison, after he finished his term as president, he gave this historic speech in 1818, where he said, "Animals, including man and plants, may be regarded as the most important part of the terrestrial creation. To all of them, the atmosphere is the breath of life. Deprived of it, they all equally perish." So the founders and the framers of the Constitution and the author of the Fifth Amendment, as farmers, understood that a balanced atmosphere, vast forests, small farmlands, and endless waterways and shorelines of their new nation were indivisible from their liberties. They understood this, and we have an expert who is going to testify about that history. So at the core of our Constitution is this system of intergenerational ethics, focused on preservation of a free people. And they understood that the natural world was the foundation of that freedom. And since James Madison, many presidents have articulated this sentiment. This is Theodore Roosevelt in 1909. He began a White House conference on children that took place for 70 years every decade. And in his first delivery to Congress on this conference, he said, "If we of this generation destroy the resources from which our children would otherwise derive their livelihood, we reduce the capacity of our land to support a population, and so either degrade the standard of living or deprive the coming generations of their right to life on this continent." And Herbert Hoover said similar things about safeguarding the health and protection of childhood. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "Definitely we are here with a principal objective of considering the relationship between a successful democracy and the children who form an integral part of that democracy, and the dependence of one on the other." Sometimes, though, it takes courts a while to get to the legal interpretation of our Constitution and have the articulation of our rights catch up with what they should be. And I think Polly Murray's story is illustrative of this. So I recently learned about this woman, and I don't know where she's been my whole life. And I hope law professors in the room will start teaching about her. Because as background, remember that from 1896 to 1954, we had legalized discrimination after Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate but equal public facilities were thought to be constitutionally compliant by the Supreme Court. But in 1944, this young woman was sitting in a law school class at Howard University. She was the only woman in the class, and she was #1 in her class. And they were having a discussion about separate but equal. And the litigation up to that point had been challenging the inequality of the separate facilities for African Americans. And she said, "Why don't we challenge separate as unconstitutional?" And everyone in the class laughed at her. And her professor told her that it just wasn't realistic, they couldn't do that. And she bet him $10 in 1944 that within 25 years, Plessy would be overturned. And she wrote a law school paper on this. And her law professor then went on to co-counsel Brown versus Board of Education with Thurgood Marshall and used Polly Murray's theory of overturning separate that led to the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. 10 years after coming up with the idea as a law student, a female law student. So amazing, right? So Brown overturned Plessy because of a creative, brilliant idea by an African-American woman who also happened to be a lesbian. And 10 years after Polly predicted it, and 50 years after Plessy had been decided, in response to children advocating for their constitutional rights, we got rid of separate but equal. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund has referred to Brown as the most important American governmental act of any kind since the Emancipation Proclamation. And why? Because it ended legally sanctioned discrimination. And yes, the massive resistance to integrating public schools forced the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund to bring hundreds of cases against school districts across the country to vindicate Brown's promise. But they had the constitutional standard to do so. So there are important takeaways here. In 1954, only 30% of the public supported desegregation. But the court in Brown talked about the evidence that they had that 50 years of separate but equal was harming children. And they reviewed that systemic discrimination for constitutionality. So the rhetoric of the meaning of liberty hasn't always translated into practice. But when children bring these issues to the court, we have seen historic change. So in our case, fortunately, we don't have a Plessy versus Ferguson that we have to overturn. And we have public opinion in our favor on the need to act on climate change. But what we do have that is like Brown is we have 50 years of evidence demonstrating the substantial infringement of these young people's rights and the harm to them from the systemic injustice of the fossil fuel energy system that our government has known for over 50 years would cause catastrophic harm and death and destruction and the loss of cities around the world. We have that evidence. And so I want to go a little bit into our state-created danger claim because I think it illustrates some of the heart of the case. And this flows from the DeShaney versus Winnebago decision of the Supreme Court. And basically, it's a classic legal analysis. Plaintiffs, in our case, will show that the government knew definitively for decades that climate change was happening and fossil fuels were the primary cause. They admitted that monumental harm would result. They now admit we're in the danger zone, that public health and welfare are threatened, and it will get worse over time. And yet, in spite of that knowledge, our government acted affirmatively to create the situation and continues to enhance it. And they knew for decades that there were reasonable alternatives to our energy system. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor of the knowledge, this one is a 1965 White House report. And it's not the first piece of evidence we have, but it's a prominent one. And it definitively identified the harm from carbon dioxide pollution from burning fossil fuels. And it said that by the end of that century, we might not be able to reverse the consequences. From that report, there are high-level government documents referring to the carbon dioxide problem as one that could cause apocalyptic change, raising the seas by 10 feet, and thereby losing Washington, D.C. and New York. By 1970, President Nixon's White House was saying that the quality of the atmosphere may well determine whether man survives or perishes. So through every administration, Democrat and Republican, we see the same pattern of behavior, acknowledging the problem, discussing the alternatives to fossil fuels, and then continuing to support and promote and subsidize and foster a fossil fuel energy system. So that today, 80% of our energy is still provided and powered by coal, oil, and gas. Even if the Clean Power Plan had been fully implemented, we would still see pretty much a flat line in terms of the use of fossil fuels for our energy system today. Scientists say that judicial relief may be the best, the last, and at this late stage, the only real chance to preserve a habitable planet for young people and for future generations. And so the remedy is critical in this case. And again, going back to the science-based principle that our Children's Trust operates under, we are advocating that by the end of this century, we have brought carbon dioxide levels back down to 350 parts per million, and we've stabilized warming at no more than 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. But in working with experts, our experts are saying that's not enough. We really need to continue to draw down CO2 levels beyond this century if we really want to preserve the ice sheets on the planet. So this is a long, long journey. And our work right now is to set up these young people and the next generation and prepare them for the journey, because the change needs to happen swiftly. We need very urgent emission reductions, and we need significant reforestation and protection of soils. We need to completely transition off of fossil fuels by 2050. And the good news is it's feasible. So we have the honor of working with some of the top technical experts and economists in the world thinking about deep decarbonization and how we get there. And they're putting together plans for how the federal government can do this here in the United States and how governments can do it everywhere. And really, like in the most simple terms, it's modernizing our energy system. And I love this image because it just tells so clearly what the problem is. I mean, we have amazing technology. We have renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuel energy today. But it's amazing what we could do if we decide to do it. It's all there at our fingertips. But it does have to happen immensely quickly. When we met with our experts, they said the transition to electrification has to really happen in 10 years. Like, we're talking about a World War II-like mobilization in terms of transitioning our systems to be electrified instead of powered by fossil fuels. But it's completely doable. It will create jobs. It will create opportunity for communities to re-envision themselves and power themselves in different ways. And then we also need to focus on protecting our natural systems as well, so they can better sequester the carbon, the excess carbon that's in the air. So from forest protection to wetland protection, to rethinking how we do agriculture. And this type of large systemic remedy of having a national plan that decarbonizes our energy system and helps us protect our soils and our forests is not something totally unusual, in fact. Courts throughout history have ordered big plans and big systemic shifts when the constitutional requirements of protecting people's fundamental rights mandated it. And we can see that both in the civil rights movement, also in the California prison litigation and other prison litigation around the country, and of course the very, very long engagement with the courts in terms of protecting salmon and the treaty rights of the Pacific Northwest tribes. So one of the key themes in Judge Aiken's decision is that the judiciary is a co-equal branch, and it cannot shirk from interpreting the Constitution and seeing if there's been a violation. But the Trump administration is determined to convince the courts to shirk their role and really upend the ordinary course of how a constitutional case should proceed, which is we won the motions to dismiss, and we had a trial date, and we're preparing our experts and our witnesses, and we're ready to go to trial, and they file a petition for writ of mandamus. And if you're really interested in what that is, you can come hear our panel on Sunday morning. A lot of us didn't really know what this was all about until we got into it. So we argued the case before the Ninth Circuit on December 11th, and there are some of the kids in the courtroom. Yeah, great photos. And this hearing was wrapped up in a little bit of drama. So one of the judges on our panel was embroiled in, what is the Me Too movement, and ultimately resigned from the bench after my argument. And now we have, these are the 3 judges on the panel in the Ninth Circuit who will be hopefully issuing an order very soon. We had seen some movement in the Ninth Circuit this week with some filings in our case, and we were hopeful we could tell you we had a good decision tonight, but not yet, so stay tuned for that. But the good news is the reports coming out of the legal community who watched the argument and from the media are all positive, really looking at this as the youth are going to win this round again. So one of the things that is absolutely critical in this constitutional conversation is having partners. And we could not do the work that we do or be as effective doing it without the immense support that we have from attorneys who work pro bono, to scientists and experts who dedicate their time, to, we have 60 volunteer lawyers and law students who do document review for us, volunteering to go through these thousands of documents that we have. We just have immense support from so many people. We also have partners who help us in really creative ways outside of the lawsuit itself. So, for example, this is on the left, is a world-renowned arts organizer, David Solna. He's now working with 350.org, but he's helping our youth tell the story of their constitutional case. And what he's preparing is called a Cantastoria, and he'll have a Youth v.gov version of this amazing communication art tool to spread around the country and mobilize people around the first day of trial once we get our new trial date. This is some of the beautiful work he did at the December 11th hearing, making these huge banners and really coming out and bringing people to support the youth. And then if any of you were here around the noon hour and had the pleasure of hearing the Raging Grannies perform, they are ever present and ever inspiring, and they know these youth and really stand with them to support them. So we're so grateful for their creativity and their song and their groove. And there are other people around the country who are using their creativity to make plays and songs and put on theater productions. And we're also partnered with faith-based organizations. This is a partner with the United Church of Christ. They've launched a national multi-faith campaign to have 1,000 sermons in congregations across the country, teaching and preaching the Juliana message of intergenerational justice and stewardship of the earth. And we're working with the youth-led Sunrise Movement to bring the constitutional climate conversation to the midterm elections. And again, young people rising up to oust the people who need to get out of Congress and positions of power and bring in the new. And And then, as always, our inspiring partner, Earth Guardians, which is also a plaintiff in the case. They are a tribe of young activists and artists, musicians, hip-hop artists from across the globe. And they are stepping up to co-create the future that they know is possible. And many of our plaintiffs come from Earth Guardians. And then sometimes, you know, the most inspiring partners are these individuals who just contact us or start doing things to spread the word about the case. From Texas to California to Eugene, there are people coming up with creative ways to engage others in the constitutional conversation. And so there's so much that can be done. And we have an organizing team now. You can go to youth.gov if you want to get involved. And one of the things that will be very important as we move forward is mobilizing people around the country to stand up and stand in solidarity with these youth when we go to trial. And it's not just about when we go to trial, but imagine the moment when we're standing in the courtroom and we get the order that the United States government has violated the fundamental rights of the youth. And when we get the order that says that they're entitled to a climate recovery plan on a national scale that must be implemented and that puts the United States on track by 2100 to being on a 350 parts per million, 1 degree prescription, and then in the next century goes beyond that. When we get that order that that plan must be implemented forthwith, and emission reductions need to start immediately, and we need a 10-year transition, like an Apollo mission or a World War II type mobilization to do that, we will need people there to push that forward, because we cannot do that without a movement. And so we will need people to stand and hold up that decision and help us hold on to it all the way to the Supreme Court, but help us, most importantly, get it implemented. So we will need all of you to ensure that that order is embraced and that it shines a light forward to a safe future for all of our children and all of their children. And I really believe that with our humanity and our scientific understanding, combined with innovative technologies and effective policies and real engagement in democracy, that our movement can find a way out of this crisis and to a place where we can pass a torch of hope to the next generation. And so I want to leave you with one of my favorite songs of Shatescott's. It's one of his new ones, and some images of, what did I do? Of hope.
One day, take a damn time till you find your own way. Been a minute, the sky is the limit. The industry game, and you know that I'ma win it. Running in the rain, hands in the ground, renegade, radical, lost and I'm found. Wanna make waves, beginning is strong, trying to find myself amongst the mask that I've worn. Magic in the moment, mobilizing masses. Music that I'm making ain't mainstream, it's massive. Rasses, ain't gonna on the other side. Life is a journey, just along for the ride. Yeah, and I'm taking it all, ready for the moment when the star won't fall. One day, ready for change. Nothing but 11 letters written in my name. Carved into stone, I'ma give him hell. Written into history, the story that I tell.
One day don't justify, we must live this life. Forever is a long way. One day don't translate, we must meditate. This moment is all we got. Growing up on these streets, making music for free. You can reach for the sky, mama told me. Growing up on these streets, making music for free. Gotta live for your dreams, mama showed me.
From the ground ground up, so grassroots. Fam in the street dedicated to you, to the homies making beats in your basement and chasing a little recognition to build the foundation. This goes out to you, to the kids running wild without their shoes. I refuse to follow the rules, following the leader man and following the truth. Young rebel, writing my own rhythm, rise from the rubble of the cities that we live in. Who am I kidding? The times that we living in give me legitimate reason to remain vigilant. Life's a game, I play it like an instrument. Let me see your hands in the sky, you feeling it. Listen to my voice, the words I speak. I'm in the streets for the change I seek. Practice what I preach, it's only the beginning. I'll make it one day, I'ma keep the world spinning.
One day don't justify, we must live this life. Forever is a long way. One day don't translate, we must meditate. This moment is all we got.
Growing up on these streets, making music for free. You can reach for the sky, mama told me. Growing up on these streets, making music for free. Gotta live for your dream, mama showed me. Growing up on these streets, making music for free. You can reach for the sky, mama told me. Growing up on these streets, making music for free. Gotta live for your dream, mama showed me.
Give me a chance, I'ma find my way. X for the crossroads that I face. I live within the beginning of all change written for you. My people, the reason that I rap. Represent your voice in every single track. H, how you learn is T for all the teachers. Teaching me to tell a story, get up off the bleachers. Easy, my life has never been. My separate motivates a stroke of my pen. CA, California waves. My Latino family from Diego to the Bay. Viva la raza, la revolución. La pelea de la gente es lo que me inspiró. Sí, from Michigan de Nochtitlán. Jungla de obsidiana, regresará. And air for the miracle of life I've been given. Never found a kid this young and so driven. One day.
We'll see you in court. Thank you so much.